And that
sure,
really changes
no question.
everything about what people are going to be doing, and as well as this information and some of the temporal markers I wanted to get to as well. So I'm going to kind of let you run with short synopsis, if you will, on some of those things, and then we'll get into some more in-depth information with some of the questions, and I'll go and start reading some of these questions because we got hundreds of them, literally.
Okay, well, let's start with the markets then and get into that in a way. The issue for the markets is that the death of the dollar is basically what our stuff has been talking about for some time, and we are actually at the cusp of that occurring, and we can almost use cusp in an astrological sense. But sometime around October 26th is when we'll really see the dollar death. Now, there are these other forecasting outfits like the Global Alliance people and some of these others that are saying that the U.S. and the U.K. will forfeit on their debt and repudiate all of their debt sometime in summer. And they indeed may be correct. But we think that for a variety of reasons that what we call the repudiation of the debts that have been associated with the dollar and have been growing, and basically all this funny money they've been printing for the bailout and so on is going to come crashing down around us. We thought it would trigger a derivatives crisis that would go from July 15th until about August 16th, and then take a few more months, basically a month and a half or so, to percolate up to the point where it starts affecting the social order of things. Now, basically, we're not saying everybody's going to be calm. We're saying that over those month and a half after the derivative crisis and the dollar comes under real stress, that indeed the U.S. government will repudiate all debt. The way it looks within our data is that everything from student loans to Social Security, all this stuff just simply becomes frozen as this mass of we can't pay this debt. We're just so far. It's impossible. The United States, technically, if you looked at all the notional values of the derivatives and everything else we have in terms of long-term debt, we owe like 11 times the gross domestic production of the planet, let alone our puny little country. And so we forfeit on the dollar. And that kind of chaos triggers off all sorts of social contract issues. Now, within the U.S., it appears that the dollar death takes from about November 5th or so of this year until about November 2nd of 2010 to more or less work through all of the phases and for it to be a national, everybody has totally felt it kind of a deal, and for some of the other changes to occur. That may mean that the digidollars disappear. It may mean, and we just don't know, we've got some level of detail that goes into some of these that would support, for instance, that for a while hyperinflation is going to rule. That the hyperinflation will come in a serious way, and it will drive the price of things like an ounce of silver somewhere north of maybe $600 or $800.
Wow!
And actually, what is occurring, of course, is that the dollar is sinking. Silver is not rising.
Right.
And at that point, the dollar will have been rejected by the planetary populace as their method of doing business. Now, we see that that's already in the cards.
Yep.
The BRIC agreements, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization agreements are all going towards another kind of a basket of currencies and or gold. Ultimately, we think it'll come down to Chinese yuan that's backed by some small amount of gold, but more importantly, the golden something or other that'll come out of Russia, and will be also backed by their resources up there. And those will be the planetary trading vehicles. But the real impact for the U.S. is going to be a huge hit on our, not only the psychological aspect of things, but on our personal experience with the dollar and the lifestyle that it buys. That is to say, by taking on all of the debt and putting it in there and saying we'll pay you back later, we've been able to live well beyond our means for decades and decades, and that's going to come crashing to a halt in a rather short period of time. So short a period of time, relatively, that the population of a whole is described as going into shock and is stunned, and people just are reeling with the shock of it all, and will be walking in the middle of the street and just stop and stand there, just dazed, because it finally hit them, again, what all of this kind of stuff is meaning. And this all really starts around July 15th as we hit the derivative crisis. We don't expect a huge amount of what we call visibility. That is to say, we don't expect a whole lot of articles about the derivative crisis until closer to August 16th or so. And it may also be during that period of time that these other forecasters are indeed correct, and the U.S. and the Associated Anglo-American Empire countries actually do repudiate on their currencies. And this is basically something that has happened 4 times in the U.S. in the past. None of the consequences were good. They were all good ultimately when we would go back to gold for a few years and have a low inflation, relatively high productivity kind of a thing. This crash is going to be exceptional because it's going to be global. And it's at that point that international stuff, that is to say this fall, when it really becomes visible, that the international social order comes under severe stress. And so that's where our temporal markers for war, warfare, and all the other stuff come from, is that period of high international stress has the potential for, at least linguistically, for a really nasty period there. But we have to be clear about it. Linguistically, we get words for war, but it could be interpreted either of two ways, and it could be that we have these new wars that go on as a result of the dollar collapse and our attempt to force people to take dollars, basically, which I do not believe will happen. Or it could be a situation of where all the newspapers that are left, anyway, and the rest of us are all saying, boy, whew, and we're talking about having missed that war because we were smart enough not to do all these stupid things. And in both cases, the linguistics would still show up. People would still be discussing the war, still have high emotional stuff around them. But in one case, it's an escape from it, and the other, you're just plunged into it. And we can't determine from this vantage point which that will be. And I actually think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Because it kind of means that the future may be mutable. We may be able to change this.
I think it is. Okay. Well, that's good news in a sense.
Sort of it is.
I mean,
there is that potential, yes.
Yeah, there's potential. Whenever there's potential, that's good.
Right.
That's very good.
Now, the other aspects of it are that if certain temporal markers within the market issues come out, then, for instance, we'll see January, February of next year, we'll see the big sudden rise in the price of precious metals, but that also means the price of anything you need, from food and energy to clothing. Anything you don't need, electronics and telephone calls and this kind of stuff, they'll just be given away because no one will want them.
Right.
We're also talking about a huge unemployment wave that's going to sweep through the country, and it'll start this summer.
Right.
And we may see unemployment north of 50% in the United States by November 2nd of 2010. And that means even with, right now I think 1 out of 6 people owe their jobs to the government, and it's funny money. And even with the printing of all of that money, the federal government and all the state government, all local, are going to contract mightily, because we actually show data sets that indicate that some counties and states and even federal government agencies just won't have the money to pay, and people will have to decide if they're going to work another month without pay or not.
Yeah, it's going to be kind of hard if they can't put gas in their vehicle or whatever.
Correct. And it also points out, we get into the subsets within the populace as to how unsustainable our situation is and how the suburbs have to go, and it even goes so far in previous reports to list, we've come up with some character identities just as typical prototypes for new individuals. So at some point as we go along towards the Renaissance, you can expect a whole generation of people to make their living as demolishers, basically, in their scavenging all of the copper and other resources that are within all the strip malls that are empty and all the commercial buildings that have to be torn down and all this kind of thing.
And there's a lot of recycling going on, and that's a good thing, because people are going to have to be, so they're using their resources and their ingenuity, and it's about community, and it's people working together towards a common goal. So that's some bright light in that as well. It's really an ugly situation, but it's also a bright situation in some sense. There's some kind of an awakening there. So let's move to the next thing that goes on when you're talking about all of that. The 50% unemployment, I think you talked about that the last time you were on as well. And, the fact that this is it's going to affect everyone globally. There's going to be some countries, I think, that may be less scathed by all of this. And does that show up in your reports?
Well, sure. Cuba is going to do marvelous. Cuba is going to export knowledge to the planet and is going to boom like nobody's business, because they've been so good at being hyper-green, if you will, ever since the Soviet Union collapsed, and they no longer had 80% of their income coming in. They had to get real serious about growing all their own food, even in urban environments, and they know how to do this, and they've been doing it for decades now. So they show up as just being a bright spot. Going to be an educator to the, Cuba is basically going to turn into a university, and to many of the developing parts of the planet. There are areas that, of course, Brazil and the Amazon and so forth won't be as impacted as the United States and England, all the way through, Holland over to Germany and France and so on. Some of the places, Italy, to a lesser extent, but Greece for sure, Crete, and some of these other areas are, we don't want to say they're golden, but because they've been poor for so long, they know how to do it well, and it's not going to really affect them that much. But the big shock on everybody is going to really hit the UK and the US, to a lesser extent Canada, but it's still going to impact them. And surprisingly, places like Mexico. There's actually some subsets within the data that indicate that Mexico is going to have a real problem with people trying to get back in.
Interesting.
But part of that is not good because it's driven to, there's a subset of the data. See, it all merges together, right? We see a thread that says we can identify geographically with Mexico. We see that it's got the support for the, in essence, a reverse exodus. And I'm just using that term instead of the actual term in the data, but nonetheless, that's the idea. People trying to get across the border, the northern border into Mexico. And then, if we go over to another area within the data, we say, what's this over here? And we see that some people, we see an area of data that shows up under disease that could suggest that some people in the southern tier states try to flee to Mexico to get away from disease states in the U.S. So we may have a hyper inflation going on, which collapses the healthcare system, which allows the now mutated versions of the swine flu to spread. We have a reduced level of nutrition because of the terribly poor diet we've had for a long time. And then this is aggravated, nationally, aggravated by the reduced resources and people trying to cope, and they don't know where to cut and don't know how to deal with cooking on their own and so on. So their diet gets bad, they get weak, they get ill, and we have a slight panic as people think that it's going to spread through the Southwest, and they try to flee to Mexico. Now, what makes us think that really is an underlying thread that shows the Mexicans forcibly at the military level resisting, if you will, an unarmed civilian invasion.
Huh.
Now, we don't know if that unarmed civilian invasion is a bunch of the currently transient workers that go back and forth that have just decided they've had it with our economy and are getting out because conditions are untenable and they're now a repressed minority simply because everybody's competing for what few jobs are available and competing rather nastily, or if there's also this other flu component to it. And depending on which one you wanted to really look at, you could see that, oh, well, maybe it's more this or more that. And probably both sets of linguistics will show up.
Yeah.
Which will dominate as anybody's guess at this point.
Right. Okay. We have about 4 minutes left here on this one, on this part of the hour. One of the things that I when we come back, though, after the long break, I want to get into the powers that be, some of the things that are going on with them, but I also wanted to get into the SOC and the ACT, because therein lies some information I think that is going to be extremely beneficial for people to hear about. And I did have one quick question that I wanted to ask you, that people are looking for the temporal marker for the woman with scars.
Right.
Was that Nada from Iran?
It looks like that. Okay, it looks like she completed that. She was not the total one. This was a larger archetype that began with the woman who had the face transplant.
Ah.
And then Biden visited when the vice crook in chief here was out of the country, and he visited a woman in Middle East who had been scarred in a horrific attack and went on to do good things, and she was featured. She was the middle part of that, and then indeed this last one was we hope the final aspect of that.
Interesting and sad. I mean, that was a sad thing to
right.
To
but
watch
we get these larger archetypes that spread out, and we can't tell from looking at that 3x5 card if it's a single incident or it's a larger archetype.
Right.
So, for instance, we're seeing the larger archetype of the disappearances show up now, and we know that that's running as a larger one, and ships running aground and those kind of things. And this because of the language coming out now, we're pretty sure that we've seen most of that language.
Okay, good. Let's see if I can take one quick question here. Somebody also, the future global consciousness, new form of internet appearing soon, and of course new electrics. We've talked about that. We talked about the new electrics last time you were on. So I think probably